The vast and unprecedented empire forged by Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor, was a testament to his singular will and the ruthless efficiency of legalism. He had united a shattered continent under a single, unyielding authority, replacing the fragmented feudal states of the past with a highly centralized bureaucracy. A single script, a uniform currency, and a universal system of weights and measures were imposed to bind the conquered lands together, while dissent was met with brutal suppression. The empire was an edifice of immense power, but one built on a foundation of terror and forced labor. The construction of monumental projects, from the Great Wall that snaked across the northern frontier to the emperor's elaborate mausoleum and its silent terracotta legions, was exacted through the sweat and lives of 1 million conscripts. These policies, while effective in unifying the empire, created a profound and pervasive animosity among the populace. The strict legal code, which applied equally to all, and punished even the smallest transgression with unsparing cruelty, left no room for mercy or local custom. It was a system that functioned on the principle of absolute control, leaving its subjects no political outlet for their grievances. The death of the emperor in 210 BCE, concealed from the public by his cunning eunuch advisor Zhao Gao, triggered the empire's rapid descent into chaos. The rightful heir Fu Su was manipulated into suicide, and the emperor's weaker son Qin Shi was installed as a puppet ruler. With the guiding hand of the great unifier gone, the bureaucratic machine, fueled by fear rather than loyalty, began to corrode from within. Zhao Gao, in a bid for absolute power, systematically purged officials and princes, destabilizing the court and severing the chain of command that held the massive state together. This internal decay was the signal the long-suffering populace had been waiting for. The first flicker of rebellion ignited among a group of 900 conscripted soldiers, led by Chen Sheng and Wu Guang, who, facing execution for a simple delay in reaching their post, chose to revolt rather than submit to their fate. Their rebellion, though eventually crushed, was a crucial spark that ignited a continent. The fire of their insurrection spread with astonishing speed. The former noble families of the kingdoms that Qin had conquered rose from hiding, sensing an opportunity to restore their lost power and influence. Leaders like Xiongnu, a formidable aristocrat from the old state of Chu, and Liu Bang, a cunning peasant official, galvanized armies of both commoners and veterans of the old aristocratic houses. The unified empire of the Qin, which had endured for a mere 15 years, began to dissolve. Its provinces, one by one, declared their independence, and its hard-won territory fragmented back into a landscape of competing forces. The Qin Dynasty, a marvel of centralized governance and military might, was ground into dust by the very people it had so ruthlessly controlled. A continent, once bound by iron and law, was now a chaotic stage where a new generation of warlords would contend for the soul of China. The collapse of the Qin Empire did not usher in a period of peace, but a brutal power struggle for the heart of China. This conflict, known as the Chu-Han Contention, was defined by the opposing fortunes and capabilities of two dominant figures, Xiongnu and Liu Bang. Xiongnu, a nobleman from the former state of Chu, possessed immense physical prowess and was a military commander of undeniable genius. He commanded a coalition of rebel forces, and his charisma and battlefield victories initially made him the most powerful man in the fractured empire. His initial actions, however, were politically destabilizing. He proclaimed the restoration of the Chu monarchy, then proceeded to partition the empire into 18 states, appointing his generals and allies to rule them. This act of disunity alienated many and sowed the seeds of future conflict. His military brilliance was often matched by his cruelty, as he was known to massacre entire cities that resisted his advance, a practice that ultimately cost him popular support. In stark contrast, Liu Bang was a commoner who had risen from the position of a low-ranking official. He lacked Xiongnu's aristocratic background and martial flair. His strength lay not in combat but in his political acumen, his pragmatic approach to governance, and his extraordinary ability to attract and retain talented advisors. Key among these were the administrator Xiao He, the military strategist Han Xin, and the brilliant political counselor Zhang Liang. After leading his forces to capture the Qin capital of Shenyang, Liu Bang demonstrated his magnanimity by rescinding the harsh Qin laws and earning the support of the populace. When Xiongnu, angered by Liu Bang's actions, forced him into a disadvantageous position in the remote region of Hanzhong, Liu Bang and his advisors focused on consolidating their territorial base, building a stable government, and gathering resources. The Chu-Han Contention unfolded as a series of engagements that highlighted their different strategies. Xiongnu achieved a monumental victory at the Battle of Pengcheng, where his forces nearly annihilated Liu Bang's army, yet he failed to capitalize on this success and decisively end the war. Meanwhile, Liu Bang's generals, particularly Han Xin, launched a series of brilliant campaigns that conquered the north and east, strategically outflanking Xiongnu's central position. As the war of attrition wore on, Xiongnu's coalition began to crumble, and his allies defected to Liu Bang's banner. The final confrontation came at the Battle of Gaozu, where Xiongnu found his forces surrounded and isolated. After a desperate last stand, the charismatic warrior, realizing his defeat was absolute, chose suicide rather than capture. Liu Bang's victory was not a triumph of martial force, but of political cunning and long-term strategy, marking the undisputed founding of the Han Dynasty. The victory of Liu Bang over Xiongnu at the Battle of Gaozu in 202 BCE did not immediately secure a unified empire, but it did definitively establish Liu Bang as the undisputed founder of a new dynasty. With the collapse of the Qin and the defeat of his primary rival, Liu Bang, now known as Emperor Gaozu, faced the monumental task of forging a lasting state from the ashes of a protracted civil war. His first actions were a masterclass in pragmatic governance, demonstrating a marked departure from the ruthless centralism of the Qin. While he retained some of the Qin's administrative structures, he immediately rescinded their harshest laws and instituted a policy of general amnesty. This act of clemency was a direct appeal to the war-weary population and a shrewd move to secure popular legitimacy. A central challenge for the new emperor was managing the very forces that had brought him to power. His coalition of allies, comprising both his original peasant followers and the powerful generals of the former aristocratic houses, had been promised land and titles. In a strategic move to secure their loyalty, Gaozu initially granted them large fiefdoms, creating a new feudal structure of vassal kingdoms within his empire. This policy, while necessary to prevent immediate rebellion, created a long-term threat to the central authority of the Han. The vassal kings, with their own armies and treasuries, would eventually become a source of internal instability, a problem that would plague the dynasty for decades. In contrast to the Qin's legalist policies, which had focused on rigid control and severe punishment, Gaozu adopted a more flexible approach inspired by Taoist principles of wu-wei, or non-action. He reduced taxes, lightened the burden of forced labor, and allowed the population to recover from the years of conflict. This approach fostered economic recovery and social stability, laying the groundwork for a period of remarkable prosperity. While he established his capital at Chang'an, an act of great symbolic and strategic importance, he wisely delegated administrative authority to his trusted advisors. Han Xin, his brilliant general, was entrusted with pacifying the eastern territories, while Xiao He, his chief minister, focused on establishing a sound legal and financial system. Gaozu's reign was characterized by a constant balancing act, consolidating the power of the central government while managing the ambitions of the vassal kings. He systematically replaced the old noble houses with his most loyal followers, but even this action was not without its costs. By the time of his death, the Han Dynasty was a nascent power, still fragile and internally divided, but its foundation was built on a principle of pragmatism and a recognition of the need for popular consent. The peasant king had not only won the war, he had laid the groundwork for an empire that would endure for 4 centuries. The establishment of the Han Dynasty under Emperor Gaozu marked a critical turning point in Chinese history, yet its initial years were defined by a profound tension between imperial authority and the ambitions of its founders. Having risen to power through a broad coalition of followers, Gaozu was constrained by the need to reward the generals, officials, and nobles who had fought alongside him. The Qin had been overthrown in part due to its complete dismantling of the old feudal system, which had left powerful families without a stake in the new empire. Gaozu's solution was to re-establish a form of feudalism by creating a new class of vassal kingdoms or principalities. These were vast territories granted to his most trusted allies, who ruled with a degree of autonomy that challenged the very concept of a unified, centralized state. The paradox of this arrangement was immediately apparent. While the emperor controlled the central core of the empire, a dozen or more princes and kings held sway over the provinces. These vassal kingdoms were essentially states within a state, possessing their own armies, legal systems, and tax revenues. The powerful vassals were in a position to defy the emperor's decrees and, in some cases, even mint their own coinage. Gaozu recognized this inherent danger, but his political reality dictated that he could not immediately challenge the power of men who had been instrumental in his rise. The early Han court was thus characterized by a constant, delicate balancing act. Gaozu had to cultivate loyalty while simultaneously working to curb the power of the vassal kings without provoking open rebellion. This internal political struggle was a defining feature of Gaozu's reign. He made a conscious effort to consolidate power by gradually replacing the most independent-minded of the vassal kings with his own relatives. This move, however, simply shifted the problem from powerful non-relatives to powerful family members who often harbored their own dynastic ambitions. The vassal kingdom of Chu, for example, remained a persistent thorn in the side of the central government, governed by a series of princes who saw themselves as equals to the emperor. This decentralized structure stood in stark contrast to the Qin's monolithic state and laid bare the fragility of the new dynasty. It was a compromise born of necessity, a political debt that Gaozu had to pay. The granting of vast power to nobles was not an ideal of governance, but a strategic concession to maintain the peace and buy time for the central government to slowly, patiently, and sometimes ruthlessly reassert its control. The imperial promise of a unified Han was thus a work in progress, a vision that would take generations to fully realize. Following the unification of China under the Han Dynasty, Emperor Gaozu's attention was forcefully drawn to the northern frontier, where a new and formidable power had emerged on the vast Eurasian steppe. The nomadic Xiongnu Confederacy, a collection of tribes united under a single powerful leader, had consolidated its military and political strength during the same period that China had been consumed by the Chu-Han Contention. This consolidation was largely the work of Modu Chanyu, an extraordinary military leader who forged a collection of disparate tribes into a disciplined and terrifying war machine. Under his command, the Xiongnu pushed eastward, conquering their rivals and establishing a vast territorial empire that stretched from modern-day Mongolia to Central Asia. The Xiongnu represented a fundamentally different civilization from the agrarian, bureaucratic Han. They were master horsemen, their society and economy revolving entirely around livestock and the mobility of the cavalry. Their military tactics were a direct product of their lifestyle, emphasizing feigned retreats, lightning-fast raids, and the devastating accuracy of their composite bows. The Han military, a fusion of chariot warfare and infantry tactics, was poorly equipped to counter this highly mobile threat. The fortified walls and watchtowers of the Great Wall, while a formidable defensive line against smaller incursions, were porous against a coordinated, massive Xiongnu army that could bypass or overwhelm defenses at will. The direct confrontation between these two powers came in 200 BCE at the Battle of Baideng. Modu Chanyu, recognizing the nascent weakness of the Han, lured Emperor Gaozu into a trap. Gaozu, confident in his abilities and underestimating the Xiongnu's strategic prowess, led a large Han army deep into Xiongnu territory. There, his forces were surrounded and besieged on Baideng Mountain for 7 days. The Han army was on the brink of annihilation, saved only by the diplomatic cunning of one of Gaozu's ministers, who bribed the Chanyu's consort to persuade him to lift the siege. The humiliating retreat that followed was a stark demonstration of Han military inferiority and the existential threat posed by the Xiongnu. This defeat forced a radical re-evaluation of Han foreign policy. Gaozu, a man who had conquered a continent, was compelled to acknowledge that his military was no match for the Xiongnu on their terms. This led directly to the implementation of the Qin policy, a pragmatic strategy of appeasement. Instead of military conquest, the Han would seek to pacify their northern rivals through diplomacy and tribute. This marked a period of uneasy coexistence, where the Han, despite its immense wealth and population, was forced to operate from a position of weakness against a nomadic power that had proven its dominance on the battlefield. The crushing defeat at the Battle of Baideng forced the Han Dynasty to abandon its military ambitions on the northern frontier and adopt a new strategy of appeasement toward the Xiongnu. This policy, known as Qin or harmonious kinship, was a pragmatic and, at times, humiliating solution to an intractable problem. Recognizing that their military was no match for the highly mobile cavalry of Modu Chanyu, Emperor Gaozu's successors opted for a form of political and economic submission designed to prevent large-scale Xiongnu invasions. The core of the Qin policy was a series of agreements that established a framework for an uneasy coexistence. The Han would formally recognize the Xiongnu as a political equal, and the two empires would be declared fraternal states. To seal these pacts, Han princesses, often from the imperial line, were sent north to marry the Xiongnu Chanyu. These marriages were meant to forge a familial bond and were a key component of the strategy. Alongside the princesses, the Han provided the Xiongnu with a constant flow of valuable tribute. This included vast quantities of silk, wine, grain, and other luxury goods that were highly coveted on the steppe. The annual delivery of these goods was intended to satisfy the Xiongnu's economic needs and dissuade them from raiding Han territory. However, the Qin policy was a bitter pill for the Han. It was a clear admission of military inferiority, a position that ran counter to the dynasty's claims of holding the mandate of heaven. The Han princesses who were sent north were often subjected to a difficult and foreign life, and their marriages did little to guarantee lasting peace. The Xiongnu, viewing the tribute as a form of payment rather than a sign of mutual respect, often continued to conduct smaller-scale raids on the frontier. These incursions, though not full-scale invasions, were a constant source of tension and a stark reminder of the Han's vulnerability. The Han emperors, from Gaozu to his successors, found themselves in a difficult position. They had to maintain the appearance of a powerful, unified empire while simultaneously enduring the indignity of paying tribute and sacrificing their princesses to a nomadic people they viewed as uncivilized. This period of bitter peace lasted for several decades. It allowed the Han Empire to recover from the devastation of the Chu-Han Contention, focus on internal stability, and build up its wealth and population. The economic tribute paid to the Xiongnu, while significant, was a far cheaper alternative to the cost of a full-scale war. However, the policy was never intended to be a permanent solution. The memory of the humiliation at Baideng and the ongoing Xiongnu raids fueled a growing desire within the Han court for a more decisive resolution, a desire that would eventually lead to a dramatic shift in policy under a new, more ambitious emperor. The death of Emperor Gaozu in 195 BCE plunged the Han dynasty into a period of political turmoil, from which his widow, Empress Lü, emerged as the central and most powerful figure. Though her son, Emperor Hui, nominally held the throne, Empress Lü assumed the role of regent and became the de facto ruler of the empire. Her rise to power was not a sudden usurpation but a calculated consolidation of influence that began during her husband's lifetime, culminating in her absolute authority upon his death. She was a woman of formidable ambition and political acumen, skills she had honed through years of navigating the treacherous imperial court. Empress Lü's reign was characterized by a cold and ruthless determination to secure her family's position and the stability of the nascent Han state. She had a deep distrust of her husband's other consorts and their children, viewing them as potential rivals to her own son's claim to the throne. This animosity manifested in a series of brutal purges. She systematically eliminated her rivals, most famously executing Lady Qi and having her son poisoned. These acts of calculated cruelty sent a clear message to the court. Defiance of the empress would be met with swift and horrifying consequences. While her methods were severe, Empress Lü's policies were not entirely without benefit to the empire. She recognized the fragility of the Han and continued to implement the more lenient policies of Gaozu. She reduced taxes, encouraged agriculture, and maintained the He-Qin policy with the Xiongnu, ensuring a period of relative peace on the northern frontier. This allowed the Han to continue its process of economic recovery and population growth, a crucial development for a dynasty still finding its footing. In this sense, her rule, though autocratic, was not purely destructive. She was consolidating the power of the central government, not just for her own benefit, but also to prevent the empire from fracturing again into competing states. Empress Lü's consolidation of power also involved the systematic promotion of her own family members to positions of influence. She enfeoffed her Lü relatives as kings and marquises, granting them military and political authority in key regions of the empire. This action directly contradicted Gaozu's promise to his original followers and laid the groundwork for a future power struggle. However, it also created a new network of loyalists who owed their entire position to her, providing a crucial power base for her reign. For a woman to wield such absolute power in a deeply patriarchal society was unprecedented. Empress Lü's reign, spanning 15 years, demonstrated that a woman could govern an empire with a ruthless efficiency equal to any man, quietly strengthening the Han state while sowing the seeds of a future conflict that would erupt upon her death. Following the death of Empress Lü and the subsequent purge of her family, the Han Dynasty entered a period of unprecedented stability and prosperity under the reigns of Emperors Wen and Jing. This era, lasting from 180 to 141 BCE, is historically celebrated for its adherence to a policy of wu-wei, or non-action, a concept rooted in Taoist philosophy. The central idea behind wu-wei was a minimalist approach to governance. The state should interfere as little as possible in the lives of its citizens, allowing society and the economy to naturally find their own equilibrium. This philosophy, a stark departure from the Qin's heavy-handed legalism, was perfectly suited to a nation still recovering from decades of civil strife. Emperor Wen, a distant relative of Gaozu, was chosen to ascend the throne due to his reputation for benevolence and his lack of political ties to the Empress Lü's faction. His reign was a model of fiscal restraint and moral leadership. He drastically reduced taxes on the peasantry, at one point even abolishing the land tax entirely. He also cut government spending, reduced the size of the imperial court, and discouraged lavish expenditures on public works. By promoting agricultural production and easing the burdens on the population, he fostered an environment where the economy could thrive. This era also saw the relaxation of many of the Qin's and Gaozu's more severe laws. Emperor Wen abolished the brutal practice of mutilation as a punishment and allowed for a more humane, if still strict, legal system. Emperor Jing continued his father's policies with similar success. He further reduced taxes and promoted agricultural production through a system of state-sponsored granaries. This period is often referred to as the rule of Wen and Jing, and is characterized by a significant accumulation of national wealth. The imperial granaries were said to be so full of grain that it spilled out and rotted, and the government's coffers were filled with surplus coinage. This economic stability, combined with the continued He-Qin policy of appeasement toward the Xiongnu, provided a long period of internal peace. However, the quiet years were not without their challenges. The vassal kingdoms, which had been a feature of the dynasty since its founding, continued to grow in power and autonomy. The leniency of wu-wei governance allowed these regional rulers to consolidate their own armies and treasuries, posing a potential threat to the central government. Emperor Jing, recognizing this growing danger, began to implement policies to curb their power, a move that would eventually lead to the rebellion of the Seven States. The era of wu-wei was, therefore, a time of crucial recovery and growth, but it also served as a prelude to a new wave of conflict that would define the next stage of the Han Dynasty. The period of Wu-Wei governance under Emperors Wen and Jing had a profound and transformative effect on the economic and social fabric of the Han Dynasty. By adopting a policy of minimal state interference and reducing the burdens of taxation and conscription, the central government created an environment where the agrarian economy could flourish. This era, in stark contrast to the devastating civil wars that preceded it, saw the population recover and grow, and agricultural production soared to unprecedented levels. A key indicator of this prosperity was the immense surplus of grain that accumulated in the imperial granaries. Historical records from this period describe the granaries as being so full that the grain, left untouched for years, would spoil and rot. This overabundance was a direct result of several deliberate policies. The land tax, which had been a significant burden on the peasantry, was at times reduced to 1/30th of the harvest, and was even temporarily abolished entirely. This left farmers with more of their yield, providing them with greater economic security and the means to invest in better tools and more efficient farming techniques. The reduction of compulsory labor service also had a significant impact. With fewer men conscripted for large-scale public works or military campaigns, more hands were available to work the fields. This stability in the workforce ensured that planting and harvesting cycles were not disrupted, leading to consistently higher yields. The central government also made a concerted effort to maintain and improve the irrigation systems that were vital to agricultural production in many parts of the empire, further boosting the productivity of the land. The accumulated wealth was not limited to grain. The imperial treasury also saw a massive influx of copper cash, a result of reduced government spending and a stable economy. The reigns of Wen and Jing were notable for their fiscal conservatism, with both emperors actively discouraging lavish expenditures on royal palaces or grand ceremonies. This austerity ensured that the wealth generated by the prosperous agricultural sector was not squandered but accumulated in the state's coffers. This unprecedented wealth became a crucial asset for the Han Dynasty. While the immediate effect was a peaceful and contented populace, the long-term consequence was the creation of a massive war chest that would fuel future ambitions. This financial security would provide the foundation for a dramatic shift in Han foreign policy under a new emperor, enabling the state to abandon its strategy of appeasement and finally confront its rivals with overwhelming military force. The quiet years of Wu-Wei thus inadvertently prepared the empire for an era of martial glory and expansion, proving that the accumulation of wealth was a necessary prerequisite for the projection of power. The peaceful and prosperous era of emperors Wen and Jing, while notable for its economic recovery, was also a period of profound intellectual and philosophical transition. In the vacuum left by the collapse of legalism and the Han's initial reliance on Taoist Wu-Wei, a new intellectual force began to take root and spread among the educated elite, the ancient teachings of Confucius. Confucius, a scholar and philosopher who lived centuries earlier, had articulated a vision of society based on morality, ritual, and a structured hierarchy governed by virtuous leaders. His philosophy, though influential, had never been adopted as a state ideology. The Qin Dynasty had actively suppressed Confucian thought, burning texts and executing scholars in a bid to eliminate all ideological rivals to their absolute power. However, with the Qin's brutal suppression now a distant memory, and the Han's embrace of a more relaxed governance, Confucianism found fertile ground to grow. Unlike legalism, which saw humans as inherently selfish and requiring strict control, Confucianism offered a more optimistic vision of society. It emphasized the importance of education, the cultivation of personal virtue, and the duty of a ruler to govern with benevolence and justice. These principles resonated deeply with a new generation of officials and scholars who were seeking a more humane and stable foundation for the state. The spread of Confucianism was a gradual process, beginning in private schools and scholarly circles. The Han court, in its early years, was a mix of philosophies, and while Confucian ideas were present, they were not yet dominant. However, as the empire stabilized and a new class of educated officials emerged, Confucianism's emphasis on meritocracy and the selection of leaders based on their moral character and education began to gain traction. The philosophy provided a moral and ethical framework for the bureaucracy, suggesting that a well-ordered state was a reflection of the ruler's virtue and the competence of his officials. This intellectual shift was a crucial development for the future of the Han. Confucianism provided a structured alternative to the power struggles and factionalism that had plagued the court since the dynasty's founding. It offered a moral code that could unite the elite and provide a common purpose beyond personal gain. This was a slow but steady process of cultural and intellectual consolidation, a quiet prelude to the momentous changes that were to come. The prosperity of the rule of Wen and Jing created the social stability and educational opportunities necessary for these ideas to flourish. These seeds, sown in a period of peaceful recovery, would blossom under the reign of the next emperor, transforming a philosophical tradition into the official and enduring ideology of the Han state. The death of Emperor Jing in 141 BCE marked a definitive end to the Han dynasty's period of Wu Wei and ushered in a new, ambitious era. His successor, Emperor Wu, was a young, energetic ruler who would go on to have one of the longest and most transformative reigns in Chinese history. Emperor Wu's ascent to the throne was characterized by a clear departure from the conservative, hands-off approach of his predecessors. While the reigns of emperors Wen and Jing had focused on internal stability and economic recovery, Emperor Wu's vision for the Han was one of outward expansion, military conquest, and a firm, centralized control over the state. He believed that the time for quiet recovery had passed, and that it was now the dynasty's duty to reclaim its position as the preeminent power in the known world. This shift in governance was not merely a matter of personal ambition, it was a philosophical and political reorientation of the state. Emperor Wu, influenced by a new generation of scholars, rejected the quietude of Taoist principles and instead turned to the more structured and assertive philosophy of Confucianism. He and his advisors believed that the Han's mandate of heaven, the divine right to rule, was not just a passive right, but an active duty to extend its civilizing influence and its military authority. The previous policy of Qin with the Xiongnu was, in his view, a humiliation that had to be avenged. The accumulated wealth in the imperial granaries and treasury, a legacy of the quiet years, was now a resource to be used to fund a more aggressive foreign policy. Emperor Wu's first acts were to consolidate his own power and begin the process of strengthening the central government at the expense of the vassal kingdoms. He faced a court still divided by the power of the imperial family and the nobility, but his decisive actions, including the suppression of the rebellion of the Seven States, had already laid the groundwork for a more centralized state. He also took direct control of the military, a power that had been previously distributed among various nobles. This centralization of command was a crucial prerequisite for the massive military campaigns he was about to launch. The new emperor's vision was total: a government and an ideology in perfect alignment, a strong central authority unencumbered by regional rivals, and a military capable of projecting Han power beyond its borders. The quiet years had allowed the Han to heal and prosper, but Emperor Wu's reign was a testament to the belief that true greatness lay not in peaceful self-cultivation, but in the active pursuit of imperial destiny. With his ascent, the Han dynasty was poised to become an expansive, conquering empire, no longer a humble successor to the Qin, but a power in its own right. The reign of Han Wudi, or the martial emperor, was one of the most dynamic and consequential periods in the history of the Han dynasty. Ascending the throne at a young age, he would rule for 54 years, from 141 to 87 BCE, a period marked by a radical redefinition of Han governance and a decisive shift from a passive, defensive state to an assertive, expansionist empire. Emperor Wu's reign was a departure from the minimalist policies of his predecessors, embracing a philosophy that demanded active intervention and the projection of power both at home and abroad. His ambition was immediately apparent in the military sphere. Recognizing the humiliation of the Qin policy and the continuous threat posed by the Xiongnu, Emperor Wu initiated a series of large-scale military campaigns aimed at permanently neutralizing his northern rivals. he professionalized the army, creating a vast cavalry force capable of meeting the Xiongnu on their own terms. Under the command of brilliant generals like Wei Qing and Huo Kubing, the Han military pushed deep into the northern steppes, achieving decisive victories that crippled the Xiongnu Confederacy. This aggressive policy not only secured the northern frontier, but also established a new paradigm of military might for the Han. Emperor Wu's martial ambitions extended far beyond the northern border. He sent expeditions westward to the Tarim Basin, conquering the isolated oasis city-states and establishing a Han presence in what would become known as the Western regions. This expansion was not merely for territorial gain, but for strategic control of the trade, routes that would later become known as the Silk Road. To the south, he launched campaigns that brought the kingdoms of Nanyue and Minyue under Han control, extending the empire's influence to the sea and into modern-day Vietnam. These military successes created a vast multi-ethnic empire, a testament to the martial emperor's vision. Culturally, Emperor Wu's reign was equally transformative. He elevated Confucianism to the status of state orthodoxy, establishing a state academy to train officials in the Confucian classics. This move created a new, educated class of scholar officials and provided the bureaucratic and ethical framework that would govern the empire for centuries. This emphasis on education and meritocracy, though imperfectly implemented, was a foundational change that shaped the character of the Chinese state. To fund his monumental military and bureaucratic projects, Emperor Wu implemented sweeping economic reforms. He nationalized the salt and iron industries, creating a state monopoly that provided a steady source of revenue, but also led to increased government control over the economy. The reign of Han Wudi was a complex and glorious tapestry of expansion, reform, and profound change. He took a dynasty that was merely a successor to the Qin and transformed it into a powerful, enduring empire that would define Chinese civilization for millennia. The ascendancy of Han Wudi marked not only a period of military expansion but a profound ideological transformation of the Han state. While his predecessors had governed with a blend of Taoist Wu-wei and legalist institutions, Emperor Wu made a deliberate and lasting decision to elevate Confucianism to the status of a state ideology. This philosophical shift, often referred to as the dragon's embrace, was a strategic move to provide the empire with a stable, moral, and unified intellectual foundation that had been lacking since the fall of the Qin. The official adoption of Confucianism began with a series of deliberate actions. Emperor Wu, acting on the advice of his influential minister Dong Zhongshu, abolished all schools of thought that did not adhere to Confucian principles. He declared that only the Confucian classics would be taught and promoted within the imperial bureaucracy. To give this new policy institutional teeth, he established a state-funded academy to train aspiring officials in the 5 classics: the Book of Documents, the Book of Songs, the Book of Rites, the Book of Changes, and the Spring and Autumn Annals. This institution, which initially trained only a handful of students, would grow to become the cornerstone of a new meritocratic system. This ideological shift had a monumental impact on the structure of the Han bureaucracy. The academy was designed to be the primary pipeline for selecting officials, who were now expected to be not only competent administrators, but also morally virtuous individuals steeped in Confucian ethics. This emphasis on virtue and education was a direct challenge to the old system of aristocratic patronage, which had often favored family connections over genuine talent. While this meritocratic system was far from perfect and was often subverted by powerful families, it established a principle that would govern the selection of officials for centuries. The fusion of Confucianism with Han governance created a unique and enduring political philosophy. Dong Zhongshu skillfully reinterpreted Confucian thought to serve the needs of a centralized empire. He infused Confucianism with a cosmology that linked the actions of the emperor directly to natural phenomena, suggesting that the ruler held the mandate of heaven and was responsible for maintaining harmony between the human and cosmic realms. This synthesis provided a powerful justification for imperial authority, while simultaneously placing a moral check on the emperor's power, as droughts, floods, and other natural disasters could be interpreted as signs of divine displeasure with the ruler's conduct. The dragon's embrace of Confucianism was therefore not just a philosophical choice, but a strategic act of statecraft that provided the Han with a moral legitimacy and a bureaucratic framework that would outlast the dynasty itself. The martial ambitions of Han Wudi were not confined to the northern steppes, but extended far into the western regions of Central Asia. The emperor's attention was captivated by legends of the Fergana horses, fabled creatures of mythical strength and endurance, said to sweat blood as they ran. These magnificent animals, native to the Fergana Valley in modern-day Uzbekistan, were vastly superior to the smaller, hardier ponies of the northern frontier. For Emperor Wu, these horses were more than just a military asset. They were a symbol of cosmic significance, a tangible manifestation of imperial power, and a necessity for projecting Han might into the deepest reaches of the Xiongnu's territory. The acquisition of these heavenly horses became a matter of strategic importance and personal obsession for the emperor. He saw them as a crucial component of his military reforms, believing that a cavalry equipped with such superior mounts could finally overcome the mobility advantage of the Xiongnu. The quest for the horses began with diplomatic overtures. In 104 BCE, a Han envoy was sent to the Fergana kingdom to secure a deal for the horses. However, the king of Fergana, unwilling to part with his most prized possessions, rebuffed the Han's offer and even had the envoy killed. This act of defiance was a direct challenge to the authority of the Han Empire and Emperor Wu's personal prestige. The emperor's response was swift and absolute. He dispatched an army of over 60 men, a mix of Han cavalry and infantry, under the command of General Li Guangli to the Fergana Valley. The campaign was a logistical nightmare. The army had to cross thousands of miles of arid desert and hostile territories, contending with a lack of water, a scarcity of provisions, and attacks from local tribes. The first expedition was a catastrophic failure, with a significant portion of the army perishing from starvation and disease before even reaching its destination. Li Guangli's forces, decimated and demoralized, were forced to retreat back to the Han border. Undeterred by this monumental failure, Emperor Wu, in an unprecedented show of imperial determination, immediately raised a second, larger army. This second expedition was a massive undertaking, numbering over 100 men and supported by an immense supply train. After a long and arduous journey, the Han forces besieged the city of Daiyuan, the capital of Fergana. The siege lasted for months, a testament to the Han's newfound proficiency in urban warfare. The Fergana king, facing a determined and well-supplied Han army, eventually capitulated. The Han did not demand tribute in the conventional sense. Instead, they took 1,000 of the finest Fergana horses and established Han dominance over the region. The acquisition of these heavenly horses was a triumph of imperial will, a profound moment that demonstrated the lengths to which the Han would go to project its military power and secure its strategic objectives. The reign of Han Wudi marked a dramatic and irreversible end to the Han Dynasty's long-standing policy of heqin, or appeasement, toward the Xiongnu. The bitter peace that had prevailed for decades was now viewed as a national humiliation and a sign of weakness. Fueled by the immense wealth accumulated during the quiet years, a new generation of Han officials and generals advocated for a more assertive, martial foreign policy. The time had come to confront the Xiongnu not with silken princesses, but with the full might of the Han military. The shift in policy was underpinned by a fundamental reorganization and professionalization of the Han army. Emperor Wu understood that a traditional infantry force, designed for agrarian warfare, was no match for the highly mobile Xiongnu cavalry. To counter this, he invested heavily in raising and training a massive cavalry corps. This new Han cavalry was equipped with superior armor and weaponry, and its tactics were specifically designed to fight the Xiongnu on their own terms. The strategy was to abandon the defensive posture of the Great Wall and to launch deep, sustained incursions into the northern steppes, striking at the heart of the Xiongnu's power base. The first of these audacious campaigns began in 133 BCE with a failed but crucial ambush at the Battle of Maiai. Though the planned trap to capture Modu Chanyu's successor was exposed, the attempt itself was a formal declaration of war and a definitive end to the He policy. It was a signal to the Xiongnu that the Han Dynasty was no longer a passive state but a determined and aggressive military power. The true turning point came with the rise of two extraordinary Han generals, Wei Qing and his nephew, Huo Kubing. These commanders, products of Emperor Wu's new military reforms, were masters of cavalry warfare. They launched a series of brilliant campaigns that were unprecedented in their scale and audacity. In 127 BCE, Wei Qing led a massive cavalry force into the Ordos region, a crucial strategic area that had long been a Xiongnu base, and secured a decisive victory. This campaign pushed the Xiongnu out of the Ordos and allowed the Han to establish new commanderies on the frontier, extending Han influence hundreds of miles north of the Yellow River. The campaigns of Huo Kubing were even more spectacular. He led a series of deep strike raids into the Hexi Corridor, a vital trade and supply route in modern-day Gansu. His forces, moving with a speed and ferocity that mirrored the Xiongnu themselves, captured the Chanyu's golden statue, a profound act of religious and political humiliation. These victories effectively broke the Xiongnu's hold on the region, opening up the western trade routes and forever altering the balance of power on the northern frontier. The first sword of the Han had been drawn, and its victories had irrevocably changed the course of the dynasty. The shift from appeasement to active military confrontation with the Xiongnu was a calculated risk that paid off handsomely for the Han Dynasty, largely due to the strategic genius of two men, Wei Qing and Huo Kubing. These generals, both related to Emperor Wu's empress, were the living embodiment of the Han's new, aggressive military policy. Their campaigns were not merely border skirmishes, they were large-scale, deep penetration strikes aimed at disrupting the Xiongnu's entire social and political structure. Wei Qing, a former stable hand who rose to the highest ranks of the Han military, was a master of logistics and a meticulous planner. His strategic vision was to use the Han's superior resources and organization to overwhelm the Xiongnu on their own ground. In 127 BCE, he led a massive army of 40, zero cavalry in a campaign that recaptured the Ordos Loop, a crucial pastoral region that had been a Xiongnu base for decades. This victory was a turning point, as it not only secured a major strategic territory for the Han but also demonstrated that the Xiongnu were not invincible. Wei Qing followed this success with a series of campaigns that pushed the Xiongnu further back, consolidating Han control over the frontier and establishing new commanderies to secure the gains. Huo Kubing, Wei Qing's nephew, was a younger, even more audacious commander. He was a master of the deep strike raid, a tactic he honed to perfection against the Xiongnu. He eschewed the traditional supply lines and meticulously planned engagements of his uncle, instead leading small, fast-moving cavalry forces deep into enemy territory. His most famous campaign, in 121 BCE, was a two-pronged assault on the Hexi Corridor. His army, a force of 10, zero cavalry, moved with astonishing speed, covering vast distances in a single day and striking at the heart of the Xiongnu's power. He captured the Chanyu's son and over 10, zero enemy troops, effectively breaking the Xiongnu's hold on the region. The campaign was a strategic masterpiece, as it severed the Xiongnu's connection to the western regions and opened up the trade routes for the Han. The impact of these campaigns went far beyond territorial gains. Wei Qing and Huo Kubing's victories struck at the very core of the Xiongnu's power. By defeating their armies in open combat and disrupting their pastoral lifestyle, the Han military undermined the Chanyu's authority and prestige. The Xiongnu Confederacy, a network of tribes held together by a strong central leader, began to fracture. The constant defeats and loss of territory led to internal dissension, and many tribes began to defect to the Han side. The Han, under the martial leadership of Emperor Wu and the strategic brilliance of Wei Qing and Huo Kubing, had not just won battles, they had fundamentally altered the balance of power on the northern frontier and brought the nomadic threat to its knees. The victories of Han Wudi's generals over the Xiongnu on the northern frontier created a new strategic opportunity for the Han Dynasty. With the Xiongnu's power in decline, the Hexi Corridor, a vital passage connecting China to the west, was now under Han control. This allowed the Han military to push further westward into the Tarim Basin, a vast, arid region of oasis city-states nestled between the Tian Shan and Kunlun mountain ranges. This marked the beginning of Han influence in what would become known as the Western Regions, a monumental expansion of the empire's geopolitical and cultural reach. The Tarim Basin was a crossroads of cultures and a network of small, independent kingdoms, each centered around an oasis that provided the sole source of water and life in the desert. These city-states, including Kucha, Khotan, and Lulan, had long been under the sway of the Xiongnu, serving as tributary states and strategic outposts. The Han's campaigns in the region were therefore not just about territorial conquest, but about dismantling the Xiongnu's influence and replacing it with their own. The Han's approach to the western regions was a mix of military force and strategic diplomacy. While military expeditions were launched to subdue recalcitrant city-states and to secure key trade routes, the Han also used a policy of political engagement to win over local rulers. A special office, the Protectorate of the Western Regions, was established to oversee Han administration and to manage diplomatic relations with the local kingdoms. The Han did not seek to impose direct rule or to replace the local culture entirely. Instead, they sought to establish a system of vassalage where the city-states would acknowledge Han's suzerainty, pay tribute, and provide support for Han garrisons in the region. The primary strategic objective of this expansion was control over the nascent Silk Road. The trade routes that wound through the Tarim Basin were a conduit for the flow of goods, ideas, and technologies between China, Central Asia, and the Roman Empire. By securing this western gate, the Han ensured that these valuable caravan trails were under their protection, allowing for a steady flow of goods into the empire. The Han's military presence in the region was therefore not just a matter of conquest, but of commercial and economic control. The establishment of Han authority in the western regions was a transformative event. It opened up new cultural and economic horizons for the Han, connecting the empire to a wider world than it had ever known. The Han's military power, once confined to the continent, was now a geopolitical force stretching into Central Asia. This expansion was a testament to the ambitious vision of Han Wudi, who saw the Han not as a regional power, but as a dominant force with a mandate to govern and protect a vast, multi-ethnic empire. The westward expansion of Han power was not solely a military endeavor, but was profoundly influenced by the epic journeys of Zhang Qian, a Han official whose diplomatic missions had a lasting impact on Chinese history. His expeditions, initially conceived as a military alliance against the Xiongnu, ultimately laid the groundwork for the establishment of the Silk Road and connected the Han Dynasty to the vast and unknown world of Central Asia. Zhang Qian's first journey began in 138 BCE, under the direct orders of Emperor Wu. His mission was to seek out the Yuezhi, a nomadic people who had been driven westward by the Xiongnu, and forge an alliance with them against their common enemy. It was a diplomatic mission of immense strategic importance, but also one of incredible danger. Zhang Qian and his expeditionary party were captured by the Xiongnu and held in captivity for a decade. Despite his imprisonment, Zhang Qian held firm to his mission, eventually escaping and continuing his journey westward, finally reaching the lands of the Yuezhi. His findings, however, were not what Emperor Wu had hoped for. The Yuezhi, now settled and prosperous, had no interest in renewing their war with the Xiongnu. But Zhang Qian's journey was far from a failure. His return to the Han court after 13 years was a revelation. He brought back detailed reports of the lands he had visited, including Fergana, Bactria, and Sogdiana. He described their peoples, their customs, and their products, including the superior Fergana horses that would become an obsession for Emperor Wu. He also reported on the presence of silk and bamboo in Bactria, evidence of trade routes that linked China to the west. The information from Zhang Qian's journey was of immense value to the Han. It provided the dynasty with a crucial understanding of the geopolitical landscape of Central Asia and the location of the Xiongnu's rivals. This intelligence was instrumental in planning the military campaigns that would later cripple the Xiongnu. More importantly, Zhang Qian's reports provided the first detailed account of a world beyond the Han's borders, sparking a new wave of imperial ambition and curiosity about the West. Zhang Qian's second journey, undertaken in 119 BCE, was a massive diplomatic mission to secure alliances with the kingdoms of Central Asia and to open up trade routes. This expedition, supported by a large retinue of officials and soldiers, successfully established diplomatic relations with a dozen kingdoms. These diplomatic contacts were the formal beginning of what would become the Silk Road, a vast network of caravan trails that facilitated the exchange of not only goods like silk, spices, and precious metals, but also ideas, religions, and technologies between East and West. Zhang Qian's intrepid journeys transformed the Han Dynasty from a continental power to a global player, forever altering its strategic and cultural horizons. The ambitious expansionism of Han Wudi was not confined to the northern steppes and the western caravan trails. To secure its borders and to project its power in all directions, the Han Dynasty also turned its attention southward. This region, encompassing modern-day Guangdong, Guangxi, and parts of northern Vietnam, was home to the independent kingdom of Nanyue. Founded by a former Qin official, Nanyue had thrived as a semi-independent state, maintaining its own army and administration while nominally acknowledging Han suzerainty. The Han, under Emperor Wu, viewed this autonomy as a direct challenge to its authority and an obstacle to a unified, centralized empire. The conflict with Nanyue was precipitated by a series of political maneuvers and internal power struggles within the southern kingdom. A pro-Han faction within the Nanyue court, led by the Empress and her family, sought to formally submit to Han rule. However, this was fiercely resisted by the anti-Han faction, led by the powerful Prime Minister Liu Jia. Liu Jia, a figure of immense influence in Nanyue, viewed the Han's overtures as a threat to Nanyue's independence and its unique cultural identity, which was a mix of Han and indigenous Yu traditions. The assassination of the pro-Han faction and the subsequent installation of a new anti-Han monarch was the final act of defiance that triggered Han military intervention. In 111 BCE, Emperor Wu dispatched a massive military expedition to conquer Nanyue. The Han army, a force of over 100 men, was divided into 6 separate columns, each advancing from a different direction to overwhelm Nanyue's defenses. The Han strategy was a sophisticated one, utilizing both a land invasion and a naval force that sailed down the Xiang River to strike at the Nanyue capital of Panyu. This multi-pronged assault was a testament to the Han's logistical and strategic prowess. The conquest of Nanyue was relatively swift. The Han forces, with their superior numbers and discipline, met little organized resistance. The Nanyue Prime Minister, Liu Jia, was captured, and the capital of Panyu was secured. The Han did not stop there. They continued to push into the territory of Minyu, a smaller kingdom to the east, and also expanded into the southern islands of Hainan, establishing garrisons and new commanderies to administer the newly conquered lands. The southern conquests had a profound and lasting impact on the Han Dynasty. The empire's borders now extended to the sea, and its authority was firmly established in a region that had long been on the periphery of Chinese civilization. This expansion facilitated trade with Southeast Asia and India and brought a vast new population under Han control. While the initial years of Han rule in the south were met with resistance, the cultural and administrative influence of the Han would eventually transform the region, incorporating it into the heart of the Chinese Empire. The extensive and costly military campaigns of Han Wudi, while expanding the empire's borders to an unprecedented degree, also placed an enormous financial strain on the Han state. The vast armies, the massive supply trains, and the continuous construction of new commanderies and defensive fortifications required a steady and significant flow of revenue. To meet these demands, Emperor Wu and his ministers implemented a series of sweeping economic reforms, the most significant of which was the nationalization of the salt and iron industries in 117 BCE. Prior to this reform, the production and distribution of salt and iron had been largely in the hands of wealthy merchants and local magnates. These private industries had generated immense profits for their owners but provided little direct revenue for the central government. Emperor Wu, seeking to create a reliable and centralized source of income, declared a state monopoly over both industries. All private ownership of salt mines and iron foundries was abolished, and the state became the sole producer and distributor of these essential commodities. The establishment of the salt and iron monopolies was a strategic masterstroke. Salt and iron were not luxury goods, but were fundamental to the daily lives and economy of the Han population. Salt was essential for food preservation and health, while iron was indispensable for the production of agricultural tools and military weapons. By controlling these two key industries, the Han government gained an unparalleled source of wealth. The profits from the monopolies flowed directly into the imperial treasury, providing a steady and predictable revenue stream that was immune to the fluctuations of the agrarian economy. This new source of income was crucial in funding Emperor Wu's expensive military campaigns and his ambitious state-building projects. However, the state monopoly was a double-edged sword. While it provided the government with unprecedented economic power, it also led to new problems. The private merchants who had once run the industries were now replaced by government officials, who were often less efficient and more prone to corruption. The quality of the products, particularly iron tools, began to decline as the state prioritized production volume over craftsmanship. This, in turn, led to widespread public dissatisfaction. The government, now the sole supplier, was able to set prices without competition, creating a new burden on the peasantry, who relied on these goods for their livelihood. This economic control, while strengthening the state, also created a new source of tension between the government and its citizens. The salt and iron monopolies of Emperor Wu were a testament to the Han's growing power, but also a harbinger of the economic and social conflicts that would later plague the dynasty. The long reign of Han Wudi was defined not only by military expansion and economic reform, but by the foundational transformation of the Han bureaucracy. Building on the initial Qin and Han administrative frameworks, Emperor Wu oversaw the creation of a massive, centralized, and professionalized civil service that would become a model for future Chinese dynasties. This process was driven by the need to effectively govern a vast and expanding empire, to project imperial authority into newly conquered territories, and to curb the power of the old aristocratic and regional magnates. The most significant change was the establishment of a system for recruiting officials based on merit rather than solely on aristocratic birth or political connections. At the heart of this system was the state-funded Imperial Academy, established in 124 BCE. The academy was designed to train aspiring officials in the Confucian classics, which Emperor Wu had officially elevated to the status of state orthodoxy. Students, chosen for their intellectual ability and moral character, would study the Confucian texts and, upon graduation, would be eligible for official positions. This was a direct challenge to the old system of hereditary appointments and a crucial step toward creating a meritocratic civil service. Another key component of this new system was the Edict of Filial Piety and Incorruptibility, which required local officials to recommend talented and virtuous young men for government service. This system, though often subject to local corruption and nepotism, created a formal mechanism for identifying and promoting talent from outside the traditional aristocratic circles. It provided a crucial pathway for upward mobility for the educated class and helped to create a new class of scholar officials who were loyal to the emperor and the state rather than to a regional lord. The Han bureaucracy under Emperor Wu was also highly structured and specialized. The central government was organized into three main ministries: the Chancellor, the Imperial Counselor, and the Grand Commandant. These ministries oversaw a vast network of subordinate officials who were responsible for everything from tax collection and judicial administration to military logistics and public works. The empire was divided into provinces, commanderies, and counties, each with its own administrative apparatus that reported back to the central government. This tiered structure ensured that the imperial decrees could be effectively implemented across a continent-spanning empire. The creation of this massive professional bureaucracy was a monumental achievement. It provided the Han with the institutional stability to endure for centuries, long after Emperor Wu's death. It created a powerful, educated class of officials who shared a common ideology and a common purpose. The Han's imperial bureaucracy, forged in a period of ambitious expansion and reform, became the enduring model of governance for the Chinese state. The reign of Han Wudi, a period of immense power and expansion, was also a time of profound intellectual and political tension, a dynamic best exemplified by the life and work of Sima Qian. Sima Qian, born around 145 BCE, was an official in the imperial court who held the hereditary position of Grand Astrologer. A meticulous scholar and a brilliant writer, he was entrusted by Emperor Wu with the task of compiling a comprehensive history of China from its mythical origins to the present day. This monumental work, known as the Records of the Grand Historian, would become the cornerstone of Chinese historiography and a testament to the endurance of intellectual integrity in the face of imperial tyranny. Sima Qian's life took a tragic turn in 99 BCE when he became embroiled in a political scandal. A Han general, Li Ling, had surrendered to the Xiongnu after a long and desperate campaign, a defeat that infuriated Emperor Wu. While the rest of the court condemned Li Ling as a traitor, Sima Qian, who had a personal admiration for the general's courage, spoke in his defense, arguing that Li Ling had fought honorably and should not be judged too harshly. His words were a direct contradiction of the emperor's will, an act of intellectual defiance that was seen as a grave insult to imperial authority. For his perceived insolence, Sima Qian was sentenced to castration, a punishment that was considered even more humiliating than death. The choice before him was stark: accept the sentence and live as a social outcast, or commit suicide and die with his honor intact. Most men in his position would have chosen suicide. However, Sima Qian, driven by a profound sense of duty to his father and a deep commitment to his historical project, chose to endure the punishment. He made the conscious decision to live in shame to complete the Records of the Grand Historian. The completion of this work, a history of over 130 chapters and 520 characters, was an act of extraordinary resilience. Sima Qian's work was more than a simple chronology of events. He created a new model of historical writing, organizing his narrative not just by chronology, but by biographies of key figures, genealogies of noble families, and treatises on subjects ranging from economics to music. His writing was also notable for its intellectual independence. He often offered his own interpretations of events and did not shy away from criticizing the actions of emperors and officials, including his own. Sima Qian's legacy extends far beyond his historical work. His decision to endure humiliation to complete his life's work became a powerful symbol of intellectual integrity and the pursuit of truth. The Records of the Grand Historian not only defined the form of historical writing in China for the next 2 millennia, but also preserved the memory of a society in all its complexity, its virtues, and its flaws. His work stands as a timeless testament to the power of a single historian's dedication. The 54-year reign of Han Wudi, a period of unprecedented military expansion and state-building, ultimately drew to a close in a state of exhaustion and internal turmoil. The martial emperor had transformed the Han Dynasty into a multi-ethnic empire that stretched from the Korean peninsula to the deserts of Central Asia. But this glorious expansion came at an enormous cost. The final years of his reign, from the late 2nd century BCE to his death in 87 BCE, were characterized by a sharp decline in the empire's financial stability and a court that was increasingly paralyzed by factional strife. The constant and ambitious military campaigns had depleted the vast wealth accumulated during the quiet years of Emperors Wen and Jing. The nationalization of the salt and iron industries, while providing a steady revenue stream, was not enough to fund the continuous wars and the maintenance of a vast professional bureaucracy and a continent-spanning army. The Han government resorted to a number of desperate measures, including increasing taxes, debasing the currency, and selling official titles, all of which led to widespread economic hardship and public dissatisfaction. The court of Emperor Wu, once a center of dynamic governance, was now a viper's nest of political intrigue and factionalism. The emperor, increasingly paranoid in his old age, fell under the influence of unscrupulous officials and eunuchs who preyed on his superstitions. The most tragic consequence of this internal decay was the infamous witchcraft scandal of 91 BCE, a period of widespread purges and executions that decimated the imperial family. The emperor's eldest son and heir apparent, Liu Ju, was falsely accused of witchcraft and, in a desperate attempt to defend himself, launched a rebellion that was brutally suppressed. The prince and most of his family were killed, an act of familial destruction that left the emperor devastated and his succession plan in disarray. By the time of his death, Emperor Wu's empire was a hollowed-out shell of its former glory. The treasury was empty, the populace was burdened by heavy taxes, and the court was a center of distrust and infighting. In a final, desperate act of statecraft, the dying emperor left an edict that recognized the mistakes of his later years and pardoned all those who had been implicated in the witchcraft scandal. He entrusted the care of his young successor, Emperor Zhao, to a council of regents led by the capable official Huo Guang, a move that was meant to ensure stability but would also lead to a new form of internal conflict, the reign of the martial emperor. A period that had begun with such brilliant promise ended with the waning sun, leaving behind a legacy of both magnificent expansion and profound exhaustion. Following the death of Han Wudi, the Han Dynasty entered a new phase of political instability, marked by the increasing power of the consort clans and the influential Empress Dowagers. The long reign of the martial emperor had seen a consolidation of imperial authority, but his death and the succession of a series of young and often weak emperors created a power vacuum. This vacuum was expertly exploited by the families of imperial consorts who, through their daughters' marriages to the emperors, gained unprecedented access to the levers of state power. The rise of the consort clans, or Waiki, was a gradual process that became a defining feature of the mid- and late Western Han. An empress, as the mother of the heir apparent, wielded immense influence, and upon the death of her husband, she would assume the title of Empress Dowager. This position granted her the authority to act as a regent for her young son and to influence the appointment of key officials. The Empress Dowager's family members, in turn, were often appointed to the most important positions in the government, including the military and the civil service, creating a powerful faction that was loyal to the empress and her clan rather than to the emperor himself. The most prominent example of this dynamic came during the reign of Emperor Zhao, Emperor Wu's young successor. The powerful regent, Huo Guang, who had been appointed by Emperor Wu, was a member of a consort clan, and his family wielded immense power. After his death, the Huo clan attempted to maintain their political dominance, a move that was met with resistance from other factions. This power struggle, which was a constant feature of the imperial court, often paralyzed the government and diverted its attention from more pressing matters of state. This political struggle between the emperor and the consort clans was a constant theme throughout the last century of the Western Han. The emperors, who were often young and inexperienced, found themselves as puppets in a power struggle between their own family and their maternal relatives. The political landscape became a serpent's coil of interconnected family networks, where alliances were constantly shifting and loyalty was a commodity to be traded for power and influence. The eunuchs, another powerful faction in the court, often sided with one side or the other, adding another layer of complexity to the political intrigue. The cumulative effect of this factionalism was a steady erosion of the emperor's authority and a decline in the effectiveness of the central government. Officials were often appointed not for their merit or their adherence to Confucian principles, but for their loyalty to a particular clan. This led to widespread corruption, a breakdown in governance, and a growing public dissatisfaction. The Han Dynasty, which had been founded on the ideal of a strong, centralized state, was now being slowly suffocated by internal political struggles, setting the stage for a period of profound instability and a complete collapse of imperial authority. The last century of the Western Han Dynasty was a period of slow but inexorable decline, a long sunset that saw a succession of emperors struggle to maintain control over a court and a state that were rapidly spiraling into disarray. Following the death of Han Wudi, the dynasty was plagued by a series of weak and short-lived rulers who were ill-equipped to handle the profound political and economic problems that had accumulated during the previous reign. The average reign length of these emperors was significantly shorter than that of their predecessors, a clear sign of the instability that had taken root at the heart of the empire. The most pressing internal issue was the unchecked power of the consort clans and their empress dowagers. As described in the previous chapter, these families, through strategic marriages and skillful political maneuvering, had come to dominate the imperial court. The emperor was no longer the supreme power. He was often a pawn in a game played by his maternal relatives. This power struggle had a debilitating effect on the central government. The appointment of officials was increasingly based on nepotism and personal connections, rather than on the meritocratic principles of Confucianism. This led to a rise in corruption and a decline in the competence of the bureaucracy, which in turn made it more difficult for the state to respond to the growing problems of the empire. Externally, the Han faced a new set of challenges. While the Xiongnu threat on the northern frontier had been largely neutralized, the financial strain of maintaining a vast empire was beginning to show. The monopolies on salt and iron, a key source of revenue for Emperor Wu, were proving to be inefficient and a source of public discontent. The costs of maintaining the army and the bureaucracy were skyrocketing, and the central government was increasingly forced to raise taxes and resort to other measures that placed a heavy burden on the peasantry. The growing economic and political problems of the late Western Han led to a steady erosion of central power. Regional magnates and landowners, who had been held in check by the strong hand of Emperor Wu, began to assert their own authority. They amassed large landholdings, built private armies, and evaded imperial taxes, all of which further weakened the central government. The eunuchs, who had long been a fixture of the imperial court, also gained immense power during this period, often siding with the consort clans to protect their own interests. This internal decay was a slow poison that was consuming the Han from within. The long sunset of the Western Han was a testament to the fact that even the most powerful dynasties can be brought to their knees, not by external enemies, but by a gradual and self-inflicted collapse of its own institutions. The political decay and instability that characterized the late Western Han dynasty created a perfect environment for the rise of an ambitious and cunning official named Wang Mang. A member of a powerful consort clan, Wang Mang was a political figure of immense skill and ambition. He was also a committed scholar of Confucianism, and his reputation for virtue, austerity, and adherence to ancient rites was a powerful tool in his bid for power. He understood that the Han dynasty's legitimacy was faltering, and that a new source of authority, one rooted in a more traditional and virtuous past, was needed. Wang Mang's rise was a slow and meticulous process of political maneuvering. He served as a regent for several young emperors, a position that gave him direct access to the levers of state power. He used this position not for personal enrichment but to cultivate a public image of himself as a selfless and dedicated servant of the state, a true Confucian sage. He promoted scholars, instituted new rituals based on ancient texts, and even, in a show of profound piety, forced his own son to commit suicide after he killed a servant, an act that was widely seen as a testament to his incorruptible character. This carefully crafted reputation for virtue was crucial. It made him a powerful symbol of moral authority in a court that was drowning in corruption and decadence. As regent, Wang Mang began a systematic campaign to undermine the Han dynasty's authority. He used his position to appoint his own relatives and loyal followers to key government posts, creating a network of support that was loyal to him rather than to the emperor. He also began to introduce a series of radical reforms, often citing ancient texts and the legendary rulers of the past as his justification. These reforms, which included the nationalization of land and the redistribution of wealth, were designed to appeal to the common people and to further erode the power of the landed gentry and the old Han nobility. The climax of Wang Mang's consolidation of power came in 9 CE. After decades of careful preparation, he felt the time was right to seize the throne. He used a series of auspicious omens and prophecies, which he himself likely orchestrated, to create the appearance that heaven itself had decreed the end of the Han and the beginning of a new dynasty. With the support of his powerful faction and the passive acquiescence of a disillusioned populace, Wang Mang forced the young Han emperor to abdicate. He then proclaimed the founding of his own dynasty, the Qin, or New, dynasty, and declared himself its first emperor. The usurper's dream had become a reality, and a dynasty that had ruled for 2 centuries had been brought to a peaceful and bloodless end by a man who had used the very moral principles of its state ideology to justify its destruction. The peaceful abdication of the Han emperor in 9 CE was the culmination of a decades-long political project orchestrated by Wang Mang. Having meticulously cultivated his image as a virtuous Confucian scholar and a selfless regent, Wang Mang had created the perfect pretext for his usurpation. He did not seize the throne through open rebellion or military force, but through a carefully choreographed act of political theatre. A claim that the mandate of heaven had passed from the corrupt and fading Han to his own new and virtuous dynasty. Wang Mang's claim to the throne was rooted in a radical and literal interpretation of ancient Confucian and Zhou dynasty texts. He believed that the Han dynasty had deviated from the principles of the ancient sage kings and had become a corrupt and decadent institution. His new dynasty, which he named the Qin, or New, dynasty, was to be a prescience, a return to a golden age of utopian governance. He believed that by faithfully recreating the institutions and policies of antiquity, he could restore harmony and order to the empire. His new regime began with a series of sweeping and radical reforms that were unprecedented in their scale and ambition. The most significant of these was the nationalization of all land in the empire. Wang Mang, citing the ancient well-field system, declared that all land belonged to the state and was to be redistributed among the peasantry. This was a direct attack on the power of the great landowning families and a bold attempt to address the growing problem of land concentration, which had been a major source of social and economic instability in the late Han. He also instituted a series of sweeping economic reforms. He reintroduced government monopolies on salt and iron and established new monopolies on alcohol and coinage. He debased the currency, introducing a new system of coinage and paper money that was meant to standardize the economy but instead led to chaos and inflation. He also began a campaign of public works, including the construction of a new capital, which was meant to be a symbol of his new, virtuous reign. Wang Mang's usurpation and his subsequent reforms were a testament to his audacity and his deep commitment to his philosophical ideals. He was not a traditional usurper who sought power for its own sake. He was a radical idealist who believed that he could use the power of the state to create a perfect society. However, his reforms, though noble in their intent, were too radical, too sudden, and too disruptive to a society that was resistant to such profound change. His utopian dream would quickly turn into a nightmare of chaos and rebellion, as the old order fought back and the mandate of heaven, which he had so painstakingly claimed, began to slip from his grasp. The radical and utopian vision of Wang Mang's Qin dynasty was met with a series of catastrophic natural disasters that proved to be its undoing. The most devastating of these was a monumental change in the course of the Yellow River. The Yellow River, or Huanghe, had long been a source of both life and sorrow for the Chinese people, its fertile silt providing the foundation for agriculture, while its unpredictable floods brought immense destruction. However, during Wang Mang's reign, the river undertook a cataclysmic shift, abandoning its traditional course to the north and carving a new path to the south. This geographical transformation was a profound shock to the entire empire. A natural disaster, on a scale that had not been seen for centuries. The immediate consequences of this change were catastrophic. The floods inundated vast swathes of land, destroying entire cities and agricultural regions that lay in the river's new path. Millions of people were uprooted from their homes, becoming a mass of displaced and starving refugees. The complex system of irrigation and canal networks, which had been built over generations to support the Han agrarian economy, was rendered useless. The fertile lands of the North China Plain, the very heart of the empire's food production, were now a landscape of devastation and famine. Wang Mang's government, despite its ambitious reforms and its philosophical ideals, was utterly incapable of responding to a disaster of this magnitude. The state's resources were already strained by his ongoing social and economic reforms, and his bureaucracy, still in the process of being reorganized, was not efficient enough to mount a large-scale relief effort. The government's attempts to provide food and shelter to the millions of refugees were woefully inadequate, and the populace, already resentful of his radical policies, saw this as a clear sign of his incompetence. In a deeply traditional society that believed in the mandate of heaven, the change in the Yellow River's course was not seen as a simple natural event. It was interpreted as a direct and unambiguous sign from heaven that Wang Mang had lost his right to rule. The mandate, which he had so painstakingly claimed through omens and prophecies, was now being mocked by the gods themselves. The river, a symbol of the dynasty's health and prosperity, had become a river of sorrow, a physical manifestation of Wang Mang's illegitimacy. This natural disaster, combined with the failures of his economic reforms, was the final blow to his utopian dream. The widespread famine and social unrest created the perfect environment for rebellion, and a new generation of leaders would rise from the chaos to challenge his authority and reclaim the mandate for the Han. The social and economic devastation wrought by the Yellow River floods and the failures of Wang Mang's reforms created a state of widespread chaos and rebellion. The displaced and starving peasantry, with no faith in a government that could not feed or protect them, rose in revolt. The most significant and terrifying of these insurrections was the Red Eyebrows, a massive peasant rebellion that would play a crucial role in the collapse of the Qin Dynasty and the restoration of the Han. The Red Eyebrows, so named because they painted their eyebrows red to distinguish themselves from government forces and other rebel groups, were a product of the profound social upheaval of the era. The rebellion was not an organized military force with a clear political objective, but a mass movement of desperate, landless peasants. Its core belief system was rooted in a mix of folk religion and anti-government sentiment, a powerful combination that resonated deeply with the suffering populace. The movement was a violent expression of popular anger against a state that had betrayed them. The rebellion began in the coastal province of Shandong and quickly spread inland, gathering momentum as it moved through the impoverished and famine-stricken regions of the North China Plain. The Red Eyebrows were a formidable fighting force, not because of their discipline or training, but because of their sheer numbers and their brutal determination. They were not a conventional army. They were a destructive force, a wave of human misery and rage that swept across the land, looting, burning, and killing as they went. Their targets were not just government officials and soldiers, but also the wealthy landowners and the urban elite, who they blamed for their suffering. Wang Mang's government, already weakened by internal strife and the economic chaos of his reforms, was utterly incapable of containing the Red Eyebrows. The army, often composed of conscripted peasants who had no loyalty to the Qin dynasty, was poorly motivated and ill-equipped to fight a guerrilla-style war against a mass movement of desperate people. The Red Eyebrows' tactics, which involved hit-and-run raids and a deep understanding of the local terrain, were highly effective against the slow-moving and traditional Han army. The Red Eyebrows' rampage was a crucial turning point in the collapse of the Qin dynasty. While they did not have the political vision to rule, their destructive force dismantled the remnants of Wang Mang's authority and paved the way for a new power to rise. Their rebellion was a clear signal that the mandate of heaven had definitively passed from the usurper. In the chaos of the Red Eyebrows' destruction, a new generation of leaders, with a direct claim to the Han throne, would emerge to challenge Wang Mang and restore a semblance of order to the shattered empire. In the maelstrom of rebellion and natural disaster that consumed Wang Mang's Qin dynasty, the hope for a new, stable order lay not with the destructive red eyebrows, but with the remnants of the old Han imperial family. From this fallen lineage, a new figure emerged to challenge the usurper's legitimacy, a distant relative of the Han imperial line named Liu Xuan. He was not the most powerful or the most charismatic of the Han loyalists, but in a world that craved legitimacy and a return to the old order, his lineage was his greatest asset. The rebellion that proclaimed Liu Xuan as its leader was known as the Green Forest Army, a large and well-organized force that operated in the central regions of the empire. Unlike the Red Eyebrows, who were a destructive peasant movement, the Green Forest Army had a clear political objective: the restoration of the Han Dynasty. In 23 CE, with Wang Mang's authority in a state of terminal decline, the Green Forest leaders formally proclaimed Liu Xuan as Emperor Gengshi, the beginning of revival, a powerful title that spoke directly to their ambition to resurrect the Han. Emperor Gengshi's initial reign was a period of both hope and political infighting. His armies, led by a number of talented generals, achieved a series of decisive victories against Wang Mang's forces. The most significant of these was the Battle of Kunyang, where a small Han force, led by Liu Xuan's cousin Liu Xiu, defeated a massive Qin army, a victory that was a turning point in the war and a fatal blow to Wang Mang's regime. This victory cemented Emperor Genshi's claim to the throne and allowed him to establish his court in the city of Luoyang, a symbolic move that signaled the return of the Han to power. However, Emperor Gengshi was a man ill-suited to the demands of imperial rule. He was a weak and indecisive leader, easily swayed by the competing interests of the various Green Forest factions. His court quickly became a center of political intrigue and infighting, with different generals and advisors vying for power. He became suspicious of the very men who had brought him to power, particularly his brilliant cousin Liu Xiu, whom he viewed as a rival. While Emperor Gengshi's reign was short-lived and ultimately failed to restore lasting stability, his role in the collapse of the Qin dynasty was crucial. By providing a figurehead with a legitimate claim to the Han throne, he gave the rebellion a political focus and a sense of purpose. He was the phoenix that rose from the ashes of the old Han, a symbol of hope and a harbinger of the dynasty's revival. Though he would not be the man to complete the restoration, his reign was a necessary step on the road to a new, unified Han Empire. The brief and tumultuous reign of Wang Mang and his Qin dynasty came to a bloody and ignominious end. The utopian dream of a return to antiquity had become a nightmare of famine, rebellion, and social chaos. Wang Mang, once hailed as a virtuous sage, was now seen as a usurper whose policies had brought ruin to the empire. His downfall was not the result of a single event, but a cumulative effect of the spectacular failures of his radical reforms and his government's inability to cope with the mounting internal problems. The economic reforms, which were meant to create a more equitable society, had instead led to widespread economic collapse. The debasement of the currency caused rampant inflation, and the new monopolies, meant to fund the government, were inefficient and corrupt. The nationalization of land, his most ambitious reform, was a disaster. It was fiercely resisted by the powerful landowning families and was impossible to implement in a society that was spiraling into chaos. The peasantry, for whom the reforms were meant to benefit, were now landless, starving, and ripe for rebellion. Politically, Wang Mang's regime was fatally weakened by its own internal contradictions. He had purged many of the old Han officials, replacing them with a new class of scholars who were loyal to his philosophical ideals but lacked the practical experience to govern a vast empire. His court was a center of intrigue and suspicion, and his paranoia led him to distrust even his most loyal advisors. The state was paralyzed by a succession of purges and a constant reshuffling of officials, making it impossible to mount a coordinated response to the growing rebellions. The final blow to Wang Mang's regime came from the Han loyalists. The Green Forest Army, under the nominal leadership of Emperor Gengshi, had proven to be a more formidable and cohesive force than the Red Eyebrows. Their victory at the Battle of Kunyang was a critical turning point, a clear signal that the tide of the war had turned against the Qin dynasty. With his armies defeated and his authority in terminal decline, Wang Mang retreated to his palace in Chang'an, a man completely isolated from the world he had tried to reshape. In the autumn of 23 CE, a contingent of Han loyalists and an angry mob of city dwellers stormed the palace. Wang Mang, clutching a dagger and surrounded by a handful of loyalists, was killed in the chaos. His body was dismembered by the mob, and his head was sent to the Han court as a trophy. His brief and tumultuous dynasty, born of a utopian dream, had ended in a bloody and violent act of popular justice. The star of the usurper had fallen, and the stage was now set for the final act of the Han restoration. With the death of Wang Mang and the collapse of his Qin dynasty, the Han loyalists found themselves in a period of great uncertainty. Though a Han emperor, Gengshi, had been proclaimed, he proved to be a weak and ineffective leader, and his court was a hotbed of political infighting. The true hero of the Han restoration would not be Emperor Gengshi, but his cousin, a distant relative of the imperial line named Liu Xiu. Liu Xiu, the future Emperor Guangwu, was a man of immense strategic vision and political acumen, and his rise to power would be a story of outmaneuvering rivals and patiently reunifying a shattered empire. Liu Xiu's military genius had been on full display at the Battle of Kunyang, where his small force had miraculously defeated a massive Qin army. This victory, however, made his cousin, Emperor Gengshi, deeply suspicious of his power and popularity. To neutralize him, Gengshi sent Liu Xiu to pacify the northern territories, a position that was meant to be a political dead end. However, Liu Xiu, with his talent for attracting and inspiring loyal followers, used this opportunity to build a powerful and independent power base. He won over the local warlords, pacified the rebellious peasantry, and began to amass a formidable army that was loyal to him alone. While Liu Xiu was consolidating his power in the north, Emperor Gengshi's reign was spiraling into chaos. The Red Eyebrows, who had played a crucial role in the collapse of the Qin, turned their destructive force against Gengshi's government. In a series of bloody engagements, they defeated Gengshi's armies and captured his capital. Gengshi himself was captured and executed in 25 CE, leaving a power vacuum and a nation once again plunged into civil war. This was Liu Xiu's moment. With the Red Eyebrows and other rebel groups vying for control, he declared himself emperor, proclaiming the restoration of the Han Dynasty. His first challenge was to defeat the Red Eyebrows, a task that he accomplished not through a single decisive battle but through a masterful campaign of attrition and encirclement. He allowed the Red Eyebrows to exhaust themselves by their own destructive actions, then defeated their armies in a series of smaller engagements. Their leaders were captured, and their forces were peacefully integrated into Liu Xiu's army, a show of clemency that earned him the loyalty of the common people. Liu Xiu then embarked on a long and arduous process of reunification, systematically defeating the various warlords and rebel groups that had carved up the empire. His campaigns were marked by a strategic patience and a willingness to use both military force and political negotiation to achieve his objectives. By the time of his death, he had successfully reunited the empire, ushering in a new era of stability and prosperity known as the Eastern Han. The hero of the South had not only restored the Han dynasty but had laid the groundwork for a new golden age. Following the defeat of his rivals and the reunification of the empire, Liu Xiu, now known as Emperor Guangwu, formally re-established the Han dynasty in 25 CE, ushering in the era of the Eastern Han. This act of restoration was not merely a matter of military conquest, but a deliberate and symbolic act of state-building, designed to signal a clean break from the mistakes of the past and a new beginning for the dynasty. The most significant and symbolic decision of Emperor Guangwu was his choice of a new capital. Instead of returning to the old Western Han capital of Chang'an, he chose Luoyang, a city located in the fertile plains of the east. This choice was a pragmatic one, as Luoyang was a more central location from which to govern the newly reunified empire. It was also a powerful political statement. Chang'an was inextricably linked with the failures and the factionalism of the late Western Han. By choosing a new capital, Emperor Gaozu was symbolically severing the new dynasty's ties to the corruption and the political decay that had led to the collapse of the old. The new dynasty would be known as the Eastern Han, a name that would forever distinguish it from its predecessor. The restoration of the Han under Emperor Gaozu was characterized by a period of profound stability and a return to the principles of good governance that had defined the dynasty's early years. The new emperor, a man who had seen the chaos of civil war firsthand, was a firm believer in the power of a strong, centralized state. He immediately set about curbing the power of the warlords and regional magnates who had risen to prominence during the interregnum, replacing them with a new class of officials who were loyal to him and his vision for the empire. Economically, Emperor Gaozu's reign was a period of immense recovery. He inherited a nation that had been ravaged by a decade of civil war and famine. His policies focused on restoring the agrarian economy. He reduced taxes on the peasantry, eased the burden of corvée labor, and encouraged agricultural production. These policies, combined with a long period of internal peace, allowed the population to recover and the economy to thrive. The Han, under his leadership, was a state that learned from the mistakes of the past. The immense wealth that had been accumulated during the quiet years of the Western Han had been a source of imperial ambition and a cause of economic strain. Emperor Gaozu, a man of more moderate temperament, sought a more balanced approach to governance, one that prioritized the welfare of his people over the glory of military conquest. The restoration of the Han was, therefore, not just a return to the past, but a new, more mature phase in the life of the dynasty. The formal restoration of the Han Dynasty under Emperor Gaozu in 25 CE was not the end of the civil war but the beginning of a long and arduous process of pacifying a shattered empire. While the usurper Wang Mang had been defeated and the Han throne had been reclaimed, the decade of chaos and rebellion that had followed the Qin collapse had given rise to dozens of independent warlords and rebel groups. The empire was not a single, unified state, but a collection of competing factions, and Emperor Gaozu's first task was to systematically defeat or pacify them. This period of pacification campaigns lasted for over a decade and was a testament to Emperor Gaozu's military genius and strategic patience. He did not seek to win the war through a single, massive battle, but through a long-term strategy of attrition and consolidation. His campaigns were marked by a willingness to use a combination of military force and political negotiation to achieve his objectives. He was a ruthless military commander, but he was also a pragmatic politician who understood that not all his rivals needed to be destroyed. Some could be won over. One of his first and most significant challenges was to subdue the remaining forces of the Red Eyebrows. Having defeated Emperor Gengshi, the Red Eyebrows were a destructive force, but they were also a leaderless one. Emperor Gaozu, using a strategy of encirclement and attrition, systematically defeated their armies in the field. He then showed his political acumen by offering them a general amnesty, and their surviving forces were peacefully integrated into his army. This act of clemency not only removed a major threat, but also earned him the loyalty of the common people, who saw him as a merciful and just ruler. Emperor Gaozu then turned his attention to the dozens of independent warlords who had carved up the empire. These men, who had risen from obscurity during the civil war, were fiercely independent and had no interest in submitting to a new emperor. Gaozu's campaigns against them were a series of brilliant military engagements, a masterclass in strategy and tactics. He used a combination of deception, encirclement, and a deep understanding of his enemy's strengths and weaknesses to systematically defeat them. His armies, led by a new generation of loyal generals, were a highly effective fighting force, and they proved to be superior to the disorganized and disparate forces of his rivals. By the end of the 30s CE, Emperor Gaozu had successfully pacified the empire. He had defeated his most powerful rivals and had brought a semblance of order to a nation that had been ravaged by a decade of civil war. The pacification campaigns were a crucial period in the life of the Eastern Han, a time when a shattered empire was patiently and meticulously put back together. The restoration of the Han was now complete, and a new era of stability and prosperity was about to begin. With the pacification campaigns complete and the empire once again unified, The Eastern Han Dynasty entered a period of renewed stability and prosperity that is often referred to as a Second Golden Age. The reign of Emperor Gaozu, a period that would last for over 3 decades, was a testament to his vision and his commitment to good governance. Having seen the destructive power of ambition and the chaos of civil war, Emperor Gaozu was a man of moderation, and his policies were designed to heal the wounds of the past and to foster a new era of peace. Emperor Gaozu's first priority was to restore the agrarian economy, which had been ravaged by years of war and famine. He reduced taxes on the peasantry and eased the burden of corvée labor, allowing farmers to return to their fields and to rebuild their lives. He also implemented a series of land reforms designed to address the problem of land concentration, which had been a major source of social and economic instability in the late Western Han. These policies, combined with a long period of internal peace, led to a dramatic increase in agricultural production and a significant recovery of the population. Politically, Emperor Gaozu's reign was characterized by a strong, centralized government and a determined effort to curb the power of the imperial family and the consort clans. He was a man who had seen the chaos that could be caused by political infighting, and he was determined to prevent it from happening again. He systematically reduced the power of the vassal kings and the great noble families, replacing them with a new class of officials who were loyal to him and his vision for the empire. He also gave more power to the professional bureaucracy, which was now a well-established and highly effective institution, and he made sure that appointments were based on merit rather than on birth or political connections. The Eastern Han under Emperor Gaozu was also a period of cultural and intellectual revival. The capital of Luoyang became a center of learning, and a new generation of scholars who had been trained in the Confucian classics came to dominate the bureaucracy. The imperial court was a place of high culture, and the arts and sciences, which had been neglected during the chaos of civil war, began to flourish once again. The reign of Emperor Gaozu is historically celebrated for its moderation, its stability, and its commitment to good governance. He was a man who, having a legitimate claim to the Han throne, chose to earn the mandate of heaven through his benevolence and his wisdom rather than through the pursuit of martial glory. He is often seen as one of the greatest emperors in Chinese history, a man who not only restored a shattered empire, but also laid the groundwork for a new golden age that would endure for nearly 2 centuries. With the Han Dynasty restored and its internal affairs pacified, the Eastern Han under Emperor Gaozu once again turned its attention to the northern frontier. The Xiongnu, though weakened by their previous defeats at the hands of Han Wudi, had never been fully defeated. They remained a persistent and unpredictable threat, a constant source of raids and incursions along the northern border. However, the Han dynasty of the Eastern Han was a more cautious and pragmatic power than the ambitious empire of Han Wudi. Its new policy toward the Xiongnu was a mix of diplomacy and decisive military action, designed to secure the frontier and to prevent a return to the long and costly wars of the past. The balance of power on the northern steppe had also shifted. Internal conflicts and a series of droughts had weakened the Xiongnu Confederacy, and a new rival, the Xianbei, had emerged to challenge their dominance. This internal strife within the Xiongnu was the opportunity that the Han had been waiting for. A large group of southern Xiongnu, weakened by famine and internal conflict, formally submitted to Han rule and were settled within the empire's borders as a vassal state. This act of submission was a major diplomatic victory for the Han, as it not only removed a major threat but also provided the Han with a new source of loyal cavalry to use against their enemies. The final, decisive confrontation with the Xiongnu came under the reign of Emperor Ming, Emperor Gaozu's son. A new series of large-scale military campaigns were launched to decisively defeat the northern Xiongnu. The Han military, now a well-disciplined and professional force, was once again able to project its power deep into the steppe. The Han generals, using a combination of clever strategy and a massive cavalry force, achieved a series of decisive victories that crippled the northern Xiongnu and drove them westward into Central Asia. The victory over the northern Xiongnu was a profound moment for the Han dynasty. It not only secured the northern border for generations to come, but also had a significant and lasting impact on the geopolitical landscape of the Eurasian steppe. The Han had finally achieved what Han Wudi had so passionately sought: the complete and decisive defeat of its greatest rival. The Xiongnu, who had been a persistent threat for over a century, were now a vanquished people, a ghost of their former selves. The Han, by using a combination of military force and diplomatic savvy, had secured its borders and established itself as the preeminent power on the continent. The northern frontier, which had once been a source of constant threat and humiliation, was now a source of peace and stability, a testament to the newfound strength of the Eastern Han. The period of peace and stability that defined the early Eastern Han Dynasty was a testament to the strong hand of Emperor Gaozu and his immediate successors. However, as the reigns of the emperors grew shorter and their personal authority weakened, a new internal threat began to emerge from the shadows of the imperial court. This threat came not from the vassal kings or the consort clans, but from the eunuchs, a class of castrated men who had long served in the imperial palace but now began to accumulate immense political power. The eunuchs, by the very nature of their position, were initially a minor administrative force. They were trusted with running the inner palace, a world of women, children, and consorts where no other man could be allowed. Their loyalty was, in theory, absolute to the emperor, as they had no family to whom they could pass on their wealth and influence. However, this absolute loyalty, combined with their proximity to the emperor and the empress dowager, provided them with a unique opportunity to gain political power. They were often the emperor's most trusted confidants, his eyes and ears in a court full of spies and rivals. The rise of eunuch power became a defining feature of the mid and late Eastern Han. As the emperors grew younger and weaker, and as the power of the consort clans began to wane, the eunuchs stepped into the political vacuum. They formed powerful factions, often in alliance with the empress dowager, and used their influence to secure key government positions for their protégés and to purge their rivals. The court, which had once been a place of Confucian scholars, was now a viper's nest of eunuch factions and their allies, all vying for power and influence. This rise in eunuch power was a direct challenge to the Confucian bureaucracy. The scholar officials, who believed that positions should be filled on the basis of merit and virtue, viewed the eunuchs with contempt. They saw them as corrupt and amoral, men who had no place in the governance of the state. This ideological conflict led to a series of bloody purges and political struggles that paralyzed the government and diverted its attention from the growing problems of the empire. The eunuchs, in turn, saw the Confucian officials as a threat to their own power and influence. They used their control over the emperor and the empress dowager to launch a series of brutal purges, accusing their rivals of treason and having them executed or exiled. The eunuch's shadow, which had once been a minor administrative force, now extended over the entire imperial court, a dark omen of the decay and decline that would soon consume the Han Dynasty. The eunuchs, a product of the imperial system, were now a force that was tearing it apart from within. The Eastern Han Dynasty, after a period of prolonged peace and prosperity, began to show signs of profound internal decay in the middle of the 2nd century CE. This decline was not solely due to political factionalism, but was exacerbated by a series of catastrophic natural and biological events. The most devastating of these was a succession of plagues and epidemics that swept across the empire, decimating the population and fundamentally altering the social and economic fabric of the Han state. The precise nature of these plagues is difficult to ascertain from historical records, but they were likely a combination of different diseases, including smallpox and other highly contagious pathogens. The Han Empire, with its vast population, a dense network of trade routes, and large urban centres, was a perfect environment for these epidemics to spread. The plagues were not a single event, but a series of waves that struck the empire with a terrifying and relentless frequency, killing millions and leaving a trail of social and economic devastation. The demographic impact of these plagues was profound. The population of the empire, which had grown to an unprecedented size during the peaceful years of the Eastern Han, was dramatically reduced. This depopulation had a cascading effect on the agrarian economy. With a massive shortage of labor, vast swathes of land were left uncultivated, leading to a decline in agricultural production and a rise in food prices. The government, already weakened by political infighting and corruption, was incapable of mounting a coordinated response. Its attempts to provide relief to the sick and the starving were woefully inadequate, and the populace, desperate and disenfranchised, lost faith in the state's ability to protect them. The Great Plagues were not just a demographic and economic disaster, they were also a profound ideological crisis. In a society that believed in the mandate of heaven, natural disasters were often interpreted as a sign of divine displeasure with the emperor. The plagues, with their terrifying and indiscriminate death toll, were seen as a clear and unambiguous signal that the Han Dynasty had lost its right to rule. This erosion of faith in the state was a powerful and destabilizing force. It led to the rise of new religious and philosophical movements, particularly Taoist sects, that promised salvation and a new era of peace and prosperity. These movements, which offered a powerful alternative to the failed Confucian ideology of the Han, would become a central feature of the peasant rebellions that would soon consume the empire. The Great Plagues of the 2nd century CE were therefore more than a natural disaster. They were a profound ideological and political crisis that brought the Han Dynasty to the brink of collapse. The late Eastern Han Dynasty was a period of profound political decay, a road to ruin paved by the bitter and bloody power struggle between the eunuchs and the great clans. This internal conflict, which began as a subtle rivalry and escalated into a series of open confrontations, paralyzed the central government and left the empire vulnerable to the numerous rebellions and external threats that were emerging on its periphery. The Han, a dynasty that had once been the undisputed master of its own fate, was now a passive observer of its own slow disintegration. The two primary factions in this struggle were the eunuchs and the great clans, or scholar officials. The eunuchs, as described in a previous chapter, had risen to a position of immense power due to their proximity to the emperor and the empress dowager. They controlled the inner palace and the levers of imperial patronage, a position they used to enrich themselves and their families. The great clans, a network of powerful landowning families and Confucian scholars, viewed the eunuchs with contempt. They believed that the eunuchs were a corrupt and unprincipled force that had no place in the governance of the state. The conflict between these two factions was not just a political struggle, it was an ideological one. The scholar officials, steeped in Confucian principles, believed that the state should be governed by a moral and virtuous bureaucracy. They saw the eunuchs as a fundamental violation of this principle. The eunuchs, in turn, saw the scholar officials as a threat to their own power and a source of constant opposition. This ideological divide made compromise impossible, and the struggle for control became a zero-sum game, a fight to the death. This conflict came to a head in a series of bloody purges. The partisan prohibitions, a period of political persecution that began in 166 CE, saw the eunuchs use their influence to have hundreds of scholar officials and their allies arrested, exiled, and executed. These purges effectively decapitated the Confucian opposition and cemented the eunuchs' control over the government. However, these victories were short-lived. Upon the death of the emperor, the great clans would regain their influence, and the cycle of purges would begin anew. The political paralysis caused by this struggle was a fatal blow to the Han Dynasty. With the central government unable to act, the empire's ability to respond to external threats and internal rebellions was severely compromised. The great plagues and famines that swept the land went largely unaddressed, and the growing social unrest was allowed to fester. The local governors and military commanders, seeing the weakness of the central government, began to amass their own armies and to assert their own authority. The Han, once a unified empire, was now a collection of competing factions and independent warlords, a state in terminal decline, and a nation on the brink of a complete collapse. The bitter struggle for power between the eunuchs and the great clans created a climate of profound frustration and moral outrage among the Han bureaucracy. A new class of scholar officials, steeped in Confucian ideals of virtuous governance, emerged to challenge the corruption and the political paralysis that had consumed the state. These men, known as the partisans, were a diverse group of scholars, students, and officials who believed that it was their duty to save the Han from its self-inflicted decline. They saw the eunuchs as a corrupting influence on the imperial court, a force that was subverting the moral and ethical foundations of the state. The scholars' protest began not with open rebellion, but with a campaign of moral and intellectual condemnation. They used their writings and their positions in the bureaucracy to publicly denounce the eunuchs, accusing them of corruption, nepotism, and a fundamental lack of virtue. They wrote essays and memorials, citing the Confucian classics to argue that the eunuchs, by their very nature, were unfit to govern. This campaign of moral censure was a powerful tool in a society that valued virtue and public image. It put the eunuchs on the defensive and created a climate of public opinion that was hostile to their rule. The eunuchs, however, were not a group to be defeated by moral arguments. They controlled the emperor and the empress dowager, and they were willing to use the full power of the state to crush their rivals. The eunuchs, in a series of retaliatory purges, accused the partisans of treason and of forming a secret cabal to overthrow the government. This was the beginning of the partisan prohibitions, a period of political persecution that lasted for over a decade. The purges were brutal and systematic. The eunuchs used their network of spies and informants to identify and arrest hundreds of scholar officials, students, and their families. These men were often tortured and executed without trial, their names placed on a blacklist that barred them and their descendants from ever holding an official position. The most famous of these purges was the Great Proscription of 166 CE, which saw hundreds of officials and students arrested and executed, effectively decapitating the Confucian opposition. The scholars' protest, though it was a heroic act of moral courage, was a catastrophic failure. The partisans, in their desire to save the Han, had walked into a trap and were brutally destroyed. Their defeat left the eunuchs in complete control of the imperial court and further eroded the moral authority of the government. The Han Dynasty had lost a generation of its most talented and virtuous officials, and the government was now a hollowed-out shell, a state without a moral compass. The failure of the scholars' protest was a profound moment in the decline of the Han, a clear signal that the dynasty was no longer capable of governing itself, and a harbinger of the chaos and rebellion that would soon consume the empire. The political paralysis and the bitter factionalism that defined the late Eastern Han dynasty were exacerbated by a profound dynastic crisis, a succession of weak and young rulers who were little more than puppets in a game of power. The Han line, which had once produced formidable emperors like Gaozu and Wudi, was now characterized by a series of child emperors and short-lived rulers. This dynastic instability was not a coincidence, but a direct result of the power struggles that were consuming the imperial court. As the eunuchs and the consort clans actively sought to place a child on the throne to secure their own power, the child emperor was the perfect tool for a power-hungry faction. A young boy, often a mere infant, was easily manipulated and controlled. He had no political base of his own, no experience in governance, and no personal authority to challenge the will of his handlers. The regent, whether an empress dowager or a powerful eunuch, would govern in the child's name, and their relatives and allies would be appointed to the most important positions in the government. The emperor was, in effect, a figurehead, a symbol of a dynasty that had lost its ability to govern. The consequences of this dynastic crisis were devastating for the Han state. The government, which was supposed to be a unified and cohesive force, was now paralyzed by a constant struggle for control. When a child emperor died, as they often did at a young age, the power struggle would begin anew, with each faction vying to place their own candidate on the throne. This instability made it impossible for the government to address the mounting problems of the empire. The great plagues and famines went largely unaddressed, and the peasant rebellions that were beginning to spread across the land were met with a weak and uncoordinated response. The child emperor's chair was a symbol of a dynasty in terminal decline. The Han, which had been founded on the principle of a strong, centralized state, was now a state without a center. Its government was not a tool for governing but a battleground for competing factions. This political paralysis was a crucial factor in the collapse of the dynasty. It created a power vacuum that was filled not by the central government but by local officials and military commanders who, seeing the weakness of the emperor, began to amass their own armies and to assert their own authority. The child emperor's chair, a symbol of imperial authority, was in reality a symbol of imperial powerlessness, a harbinger of the chaos that would soon consume the Han Dynasty. The decades of political paralysis, economic hardship, and devastating plagues that had consumed the Eastern Han Dynasty created a fertile ground for a new mass movement of rebellion. This movement, the Yellow Turban Rebellion, was not a traditional aristocratic uprising but a deeply religious peasant insurrection that would prove to be the final, catastrophic blow to the Han state. Its leaders were the three brothers, Zhang Zhu, Zhang Liang, and Zhang Bao, who used a new, popular form of Taoism to ignite the anger and desperation of the peasantry. The yellow turbans, so named for the yellow cloth they wore on their heads, were a product of the profound spiritual crisis that was consuming the Han. The government, with its failed Confucian ideology, had proven itself incapable of protecting the people from famine and disease. In this vacuum, the brothers Zhang offered a powerful alternative. They preached a new, millenarian form of Taoism that promised salvation and a new era of great peace, Taiping, where the Han Dynasty, which they called the Blue Heaven, would be replaced by a new, virtuous Yellow Heaven. Their message of social and spiritual change resonated deeply with a population that had been abandoned by the state. The rebellion began in 184 CE, with a coordinated uprising across 8 provinces of the empire. The Yellow Turban armies were a massive force, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, a testament to the popular appeal of their message. They were not a conventional army but a mass movement of desperate, poorly armed peasants. However, their sheer numbers and their religious fervour made them a formidable force. They were not just fighting for a political cause, they were fighting for a spiritual one, and their belief in a new, golden age gave them a strength and a determination that was difficult to counter. The Han government's response was a catastrophic failure. The central government, paralysed by the power struggle between the eunuchs and the great clans, was unable to mount a coordinated response. The imperial army, which had been weakened by years of neglect, was poorly motivated and ill-equipped to fight a mass movement of this scale. The local officials and military commanders, seeing the weakness of the central government, were forced to rely on their own resources, and the empire, in effect, dissolved into a series of local wars. While the Yellow Turban Rebellion was eventually crushed, its impact was profound and irreversible. The rebellion had exposed the terminal weakness of the Han state and had shattered the last vestiges of its authority. The Han military, in its attempt to suppress the rebellion, had empowered a new class of local military commanders and warlords who, seeing the power vacuum, would soon turn their armies against the central government. The Yellow Turban Rebellion, though a failure in its own right, was the final act in the long decline of the Han, a spark that ignited a series of events that would lead to the complete collapse of the empire and a new, more destructive era of civil war. The suppression of the Yellow Turban Rebellion, while a military victory for the Han Dynasty, proved to be a fatal blow to the central government. In its desperate attempts to contain the massive peasant uprising, the Han court had been forced to delegate immense power to regional military commanders and local officials. These men, empowered with the authority to raise their own private armies and to conscript local populations, were initially seen as saviours of the state. However, as the rebellion was crushed and the immediate threat subsided, these commanders, who now commanded vast armies and controlled significant territories, were unwilling to relinquish their newfound power. The empire, which had been a single, unified entity, now fractured into a collection of independent fiefdoms, a landscape of competing warlords who would soon turn their fury against each other. The power vacuum created by the collapse of central authority was filled by men who were masters of war and politics. Men like Dong Zhuo, a ruthless frontier general, and Cao Cao, a brilliant military strategist and administrator, rose from obscurity to prominence. These warlords were not fighting for the Han Dynasty. They were fighting for their own survival and for the right to rule. The Han Emperor, who was now a helpless prisoner in the capital, was a mere pawn in a game of power, a symbol of a dynasty that had lost all its authority. The years that followed were a period of unremitting civil war. The warlords, with their private armies and their control over key territories, fought a series of brutal and protracted campaigns against each other. The old Han bureaucracy, which had been a source of stability for centuries, was now a battleground for competing factions. The great clans and the eunuchs, who had once been the primary source of political intrigue, were now irrelevant, their power eclipsed by the fury of the warlords. The war was a devastating period for the Han populace. The agrarian economy, which had been the foundation of the dynasty's prosperity, was destroyed. The population, which had been decimated by plagues and famine, was now subjected to a new wave of death and destruction. The cities and the countryside were ravaged, and millions of people were killed, either in battle or in the subsequent famines and plagues. The Han, which had been a model of peace and stability for centuries, was now a continent-spanning battlefield, a testament to the fact that even the most powerful dynasties can be brought to its knees by its own internal contradictions. The warlord's fury, which had been unleashed to save the Han, had now become the force that would destroy it. The final act of the Han Dynasty had begun, and a new, more destructive era of civil war was about to consume the empire. The long and brutal civil war that followed the collapse of the Han central government was a period of great chaos and violence, but from this maelstrom of destruction, a new power began to emerge. This power belonged to Cao Cao, a brilliant and ruthless warlord who, through a combination of strategic genius and political cunning, would seize control of the imperial court and become the true power behind the throne. Cao Cao was not a traditional warlord. He was a man of immense talent, a poet, a military strategist, and an administrator. He was a product of the late Han's political chaos, a man who rose from a relatively humble background to become the most powerful man in the empire. Cao Cao's rise to power began in 196 CE, when he brought the last Han emperor, Emperor Xian, to his new capital in Xuchang. This act of rescuing the emperor was a masterstroke of political maneuvering. By placing the emperor under his protection, Cao Cao gained a veneer of legitimacy that his rivals lacked. He was not a rebel or a usurper, but a loyal Han official who was acting to protect the emperor from the chaos of civil war. He would govern in the emperor's name, issuing edicts and decrees that, while nominally from the emperor, were in reality the will of Cao Cao. This arrangement, where Cao Cao was the de facto ruler of the empire while Emperor Xian was a mere figurehead, was a new form of governance that would become a central feature of the late Han. Cao Cao was, in effect, a kingmaker, a man who ruled without claiming the throne himself. He was a pragmatic politician who understood that the Han Dynasty, though a hollow shell, still held a powerful symbolic authority. By using this authority, he could legitimize his rule and rally his allies to his cause. Cao Cao's power, however, was not based on legitimacy alone. He was also a brilliant military commander. He led a series of successful campaigns that defeated his rivals, including the formidable warlord Yuan Shao at the Battle of Guandu. His armies, a well-disciplined and highly effective fighting force, were the instrument of his will, and he used them to systematically conquer his rivals and to consolidate his control over the northern part of the empire. By the early 3rd century CE, Cao Cao had become the undisputed master of the northern half of China. He had pacified the region and had brought a semblance of order to a land that had been ravaged by decades of civil war. However, he never claimed the title of emperor for himself, a final act of political cunning that demonstrated his understanding of the Han's enduring symbolic power. The last Han emperor, Emperor Xian, was a mere prisoner in his own court, and the Han Dynasty, which had ruled for 4 centuries, was now a dynasty in name only, a final, lingering shadow of its former self. The final act of the Han Dynasty was not a dramatic military defeat or a bloody revolution, but a quiet and peaceful abdication. The last Han emperor, Emperor Xian, who had been a powerless prisoner in his own court for over 2 decades, formally abdicated the throne in 220 CE. His abdication was not a choice but a formality, a choreographed act of political theatre that officially brought an end to a dynasty that had ruled for 4 centuries. With this act, the Han Dynasty, which had been a fading shadow for so long, finally disappeared from the stage of history, and a new era of civil war, known as the Three Kingdoms period, began. The peaceful abdication of Emperor Xian was a testament to the political genius of Cao Cao's son and successor, Cao Pi. Cao Pi, who had inherited his father's vast power, understood that a formal abdication would provide a veneer of legitimacy to his own claim to the throne. He would not be seen as a usurper, but as a rightful successor, a man who had received the mandate of heaven from the last Han emperor. He forced Emperor Xian to abdicate in his favour, and then, in a symbolic act of power, proclaimed the founding of his own dynasty, the Wei dynasty. The end of the Han Dynasty, though a profound historical moment, was not a complete break from the past. The influence of its laws, institutions, and cultural legacy would continue to shape China for the next 2 millennia. The Han's greatest legacy was its imperial bureaucracy. The system of selecting officials based on merit, which had been established by Han Wudi, would be a model for all future Chinese dynasties. The Confucian principles that had been the foundation of the Han's bureaucracy would become the official ideology of the Chinese state, providing a moral and ethical framework for governance that would endure for centuries. The Han also left a lasting cultural legacy. The Chinese people, who had been a collection of disparate tribes and kingdoms, now saw themselves as a single people, the people of Han, Hanren. The Han script, a standardized form of writing, became the universal language of a vast and diverse empire. The Silk Road, which had been opened by Han military expansion and diplomacy, became a permanent feature of the Chinese economy, a conduit for the flow of goods and ideas between East and West. The Han dynasty, in its final years, had been a hollow shell, a state consumed by its own internal contradictions. But its legacy was a testament to the fact that even the greatest dynasties, in their decline, can leave a lasting imprint on history. The Han, a dynasty that had risen from the ashes of the Qin, would in turn become the foundation for a new era of Chinese civilization. The Han dynasty had ended, but its influence would linger, a powerful and enduring shadow that would forever shape the destiny of China.